The worst ever carol singers, the worst you ever could meet, knocked on the door of number 1 at the beginning of the street. Mr. and Mrs. Peters opened the door and they were delighted. The singers started singing straight away. They were nervous but excited. The first song they sang was a classic, the carol that's called... But the way that these singers sang it, it was more like a violent fright. Mrs. Peters covered her ears. Mr. Peters, he couldn't stand it. He grabbed the door quite tightly, then, all of a sudden, he slammed it. The worst ever carol singers, the worst that anyone knew, have now moved on from number 1 and headed to number 2. The whole of the O'Malley family, mum, dad, 2 daughters, 1 son, ran to the door and assembled, just as the singing begun. The singers sang a song about Rudolph, a reindeer who had a red nose. But only 2 of them got the words right, and the rest had forgot how it goes. The O'Malleys were so disappointed, Mam said.
That's the worst thing I've heard in years.
One of the daughters was crying, and the other one stuffed socks in her ears. The worst ever carol singers, the worst that ever could be, have now moved on from number 2 and headed to number 3. It was the home of Freddie McGinty, an old man who lived on his own, but he was always happy to welcome any visitors who came to his home. The singers sang a song filled with joy and peace, but in the hands of these shocking singers you'd want to dial the music police. Old man Freddie McGinty made the singers stop in mid-flow. He said,
"Sorry, my dinner is burning. I simply can't stay, I must go."
The worst ever carol singers, the worst of all others before, have now moved on from number 3 and headed to number 4. The Hoopers didn't celebrate Christmas, but they liked Christmas songs anyway. So when they saw singers approaching, they were already in their doorway. Their song was about a white Christmas. Well, dreaming of one, to be fair. But what they sang wasn't so dreamy. It was more like, in fact, a nightmare. The Hoopers, completely dumbfounded, couldn't believe what they'd heard. They closed the door silently, sighing, and neither one of them uttered a word. The worst ever carol singers, the worst carol singers alive, have now moved on from number 4 and headed to number 5. Mrs. Johnson opened the door up, along with 3 dogs and a cat, hoping for some Christmas spirit, as she stood on her own welcome mat. The singers sang, yes, that was their latest song choice. They destroyed it without even trying, because none of them had a good voice. The dogs started howling and barking. The cat joined in fairly soon. Mrs. Johnson just smiled at them, knowing that her pets could hold better a tune. The worst ever carol singers, the worst to ever exist, have now moved on from number 5 and headed to number 6. There were dozens of kids at a party. Well, after all, it was Friday night, so the kids came into the hallway to enjoy and witness the sight. The singers, they tried something easy and began to belt out. One of the kids shouted, "Rubbish! This stinks and it reeks and it smells." The other kids started off laughing, which wasn't a nice thing to do. The singers thought they'd bring so much joy. 'Twasn't their fault that 'twasn't true. The worst ever carol singers, the worst between earth and heaven, have now moved on from number 6 and headed to number 7. A grumpy old man called Trevor was the only resident there. He opened the door very slowly and he gave them a steely-eyed stare. The singers started off a new carol with but it was dreadful, just truly dreadful. In fact, the worst of the evening so far. Trevor said,
"Are you here asking for money? Because I'll pay if you promise to stop."
One of the singers just held out her bucket and she sighed as she heard the coins drop. The worst ever carol singers, the worst, there is no debate, have now moved on from number 7 and headed to number 8. It was a home of Miss Molly Mathers, who was known to be good, kind and sweet. Of course, the singers knew nothing. To them, it was just a house on the street.
We wish you a Merry Christmas.
They sang as she opened the door, but somehow it sounded tremendous, 1,000,000 times better than ever before.
How splendid!
Said Miss Molly Mathers.
You brought me such seasonal cheer, and I wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
The worst ever carol singers walked away with no looking back, relieved and certainly grateful that this street was a small cul-de-sac.